When you grow up in agriculture and later work in politics for a while, you realize something. Some of these politicians just do not understand rural America. And that is what Brian Reisinger has learned. Hi, I'm Dave Price. Brian is a family farmer, a former newspaper journalist, a freelance writer, a strategist, owner of his own firm, and the author of a book that could unfortunately be on the family crest of too many farmers. The book is called Land Rich, Cash Poor. We first talked with Brian here on the podcast in late 2024. Since then, he has traveled across the country talking to other farmers and agricultural groups about what's happening and about what politicians just don't seem to get right. Brian, welcome back. How are you?
That's good to be with you. I'm doing great. How about yourself?
Awesome. Always good to catch up with you. You travel around the country, so we're getting you. Where are you? Wisconsin?
I'm in California at the moment. I was back at the family farm in Wisconsin just the other week. So we're getting a whole cross section here these days.
That's why I've got to check in because I never know which state you're going to be in. All right. Well, hello, West Coast. And we're recording this in the morning, which means you are getting up especially early for us. So appreciate that.
Well, we call that farm boy hours. So I'd be doing something if we weren't talking to you. I'd rather be doing this. So
Plus the toddler at home too. I'm sure it has an early schedule always.
we're raising her to be an independent lady. So she does as she pleases. And sometimes that means early morning hours as well.
Outstanding. Love it. Hey, a bunch of things I wanted to catch up with you on. And I don't want this to be all doom and gloom, but we got to hit a couple of the numbers that are out before us right now. And I wanted to just hit bankruptcies first, just to kind of get your initial reaction about what you make of these. And as we look at these, we had 216 nationally in 2024, 315 though in 2025. These are American Farm Bureau Federation numbers. So that roughly represents a 46% increase. When you just see those headline numbers, what do those mean to you?
What it says to me is that we're seeing the deep issues that have been hitting our family farms for decades getting amplified in one way or another by one thing or another. I think people are going to try to, attribute it to one particular thing. People have different theories, and I'll just say, some of those are grounded in reality and some of them are colored by politics sometimes. And I think here's the reality. I think farmers are going into a situation here where rising costs are rising even more. You got things like fertilizer prices and other things that are impacted by all kinds of global forces. You've got the that they're facing around commodity prices, and then you have things like the trade disputes worked into that. And so I do think that it's important that we face the trade realities. And there are people who will tell you that, the trade dispute is wiping out our farms, and that's the problem. There's other people who will tell you, well, farmer support getting tougher on trade because there's a lot of unfair trade out there. And there's truth to both those things to a degree. I think it's important for people to know that trade disputes add to this, but the rising costs and other structural issues, they're getting amplified by a lot of things these days, and that's what I think of when I see those farm bankruptcies.
That answer you just said right there shows that you are not working for a political campaign right now, because that answer is not allowed in today's politics, right? It's got to be hard and fast, one or the other. Trump's screwing us or Trump is the savior, right? Like with trade, like it's got to be one or the other, but it does seem far more nuanced than that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And look, I mean, just to touch on that political element for a second here, I don't speak for all farmers. You know them well enough to know they all got their own opinions on all
For
kinds of things.
sure.
But in general, there's a lot of farmers out there who have said that, global trade hadn't been their friend necessarily in terms of all the way the trade deals impact things. They know that China and others have been screwing us for decades and keeping prices down and different things like that. At the same time, we got a lot of different types of farms, corn, soybeans, and other types of crops, which the farm that I grew up on grows as well, just like so many farms. And, those crops do depend on having markets across the globe that are open. So, farmers kind of need fair trade and free trade, and you kind of got one party or another arguing for half of that some of the time and half of that the other part of the time. So the political discussion it's not a knock on anybody who's in
Yeah.
politics, just to say that it doesn't really capture the real life realities that our farm families live.
Okay, and I'm also curious with you, especially with the book you wrote, that when you saw these headline numbers that we lost another 15,000 farms in 2025, that one maybe didn't shock me as much, but when I saw a little context for a stat that was essentially we lost about 1 in 11, 1 in 12 farms, something like that, just since 2018. I think that one maybe hit me a little differently about it just captures this long slide and change we have.
Long slide is exactly right. When you take these numbers over the course of the decades since it began, that's one of the things we did in Land Rich Cash is we dove deep, and this really began in the 1920s. But since basically the Great Depression era, we've lost 45,000 farms per year on average for a century, 45,000 a year for a century. And so you're right. You look at those annual numbers and they hit, and you're kind of like, well, I know we've been losing farms, and you try to put that one year into context. When you brought
Mhm.
it out a little more like you did, or when you brought it out over the course of decades up to a century, you see, look, 45,000 a year for a century, like it waxes and wanes, and there's going to be years that are going to lull us into thinking, well, maybe it's a little bit better, or maybe it's still bad, but not as bad as it was. But we can't allow ourselves to be lulled because of that long slide. And here's where it goes going forward. You mentioned my little girl. She's 2. I'm 41 years old. If we keep losing farms going forward at the rate we have in the past, 45,000 a year on average over all the years, do that going forward, we're going to lose the rest of our family farms in this country within the next 40 years, within the next generation, by the time my little girl is my age. So that's a pretty terrifying thing. It also means we've got a whole lot of farms left to save too. So there's two sides to that coin.
You were I feel like you're such a typical ag guy in that, first of all, when we began this conversation, I didn't even know in which state you were because you you have things going on primarily in two different states, Wisconsin and
Yeah,
California. But you also have a couple of different gigs too, because you stay connected to farming, but you still help with strategy. You're not
yeah,
actively working on political campaigns, right?
correct. Yep, correct.
Um, I just wonder if you have faith that in today's climate, they can figure out a farm bill, for example. I read this week, and we're talking as we move toward the end of March. Maybe in April, we'll finally get this next farm bill going. I feel like I've heard that 1,000 times over the last half dozen years. But
Yeah,
is the climate of compromise working together so fractured that it's going to be difficult to do this because like I always say in this conversation, I didn't grow up on a farm. I grew up in southern Illinois, like literally right next to them,
yeah,
and my family didn't have any active farmers. My wife's side did and still does. So while she grew up in Florida and the farms were in the Midwest, she wasn't actively part of that, but her dad used to go there over the summer and go to his grandparents. So, that's sort of our connection, sort of as these stories are told over the years.
yeah,
But as we have these weekly conversations with folks like you, what gets my head spinning is like, what's the future here? Because if we look at these trends where we just keep losing family farms,
yeah,
like, I mean, how is that going to stop?
yeah.
I'm based in Iowa. We've lost a ton of them, and we've seen, it just doesn't take as many people to do a farm anymore, right? And the only real growth we have, according to the USDA numbers, would be those that have like $1 million and more in sales, and the rest
Yeah.
of them we're largely losing those farms. So, like, can there be some kind of tipping point going the other way, or has that ship sailed?
Yeah. It's so amazing. The reality of the answer to that question is it only will continue if we tell ourselves there's no way to stop it.
Mm.
And the reason I say that is not just like some kind of blind Pollyanna-ish thing. The reality of the situation is that we have there's also a little bit of growth going on the really, really, really small
Yeah.
side. You got these organic farmers,
Mhm.
or maybe not organic, but different specialty crop farmers who, all they're looking for is 20, 40 acres so they can go sell at farmers markets. So like there's a little bit of growth there too. And we're in this moment where people care more than ever about where their food and fiber comes from. And so if everybody in the country were to shift a little bit how they bought their food, it really would shift the entire agriculture market. We could have more value add agriculture as opposed to only commodity agriculture. You could have a mix of things. Those things are very possible. And it is also possible in the political context. And here's why I say that. The gridlock right now is as bad as it's ever been. The partisanship is as bad as it's ever been. You know that. I'm not going to deny that. Um, but we are in a political climate right now where if the politicians read it right, they will actually try to get a farm bill done. And here's why I say that. You're right. I don't work in political campaigns anymore. I haven't done that for a number of years, but I did that for a good chunk of a decade.
Hmm.
Uh, and, coming out of it now, working on bipartisan issues for my day job and writing about these other issues independently, I look at both parties and I say, the reality of this midterm in 2026 is both parties, if they want to have any credibility with the voters that win elections in this country, which is swing voters in battleground states, which are ag states, they have to have credibility on the economic issues. And if you want to go in rural communities that have powered the victories of the GOP, and the GOP need that turnout as high as possible, the Democrats need to peel a little bit of that off, either win a few of those folks back or keep them home. Both parties have to be able to speak to that rural vote in battleground states. You want to talk in a farm community about the economy, you better come in with a pretty dang good answer on the farm
Hmm.
bill. You're going to have any credibility on any of the rest of what you're talking about. You got to be able to talk about rising costs. You got to be able to talk about the broader economic agenda, but you also got to be like, hey, when are we going to have this farm bill? I mean, that's where people are at. And so I think that if the GOP wants to maximize the kind of rural turnout they have to win 2026, they've got to have practical economic solutions they can point to. I think the farm bill is part of that. And I think if any Democrats want to have any credibility, if they want to be the party that's coming back and taking those economic kitchen table issues back from the GOP, particularly in the rural states, they've got to have credibility in farm communities, or they're going to remain nowhere. So I think if both parties actually read these signals correctly, they would be seizing this moment to deal with these economic issues, including stuff like the farm bill.
Two things kind of come to mind as I'm hearing you say that. I'm thinking the failure of the parties, both parties, to address some of these things, in my mind, maybe is an example of why we keep having these tidal wave shifts back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We go with a party, we go all out. We give one party the White House, both chambers of Congress. And we're like, oh man, not a fan of that. And then we do this hard swing and go the other way. And it's instead of more generationally or maybe even a decade, it's almost like every 2 years or at least every 4 years. So it's as they become more sort of hardened and focused on their base and core and staying in power and all that, it kind of works against them. And
Yeah.
we keep rebelling them, which makes me wonder if we're going to see another one of those cycles in 2026, like you're talking about here in the November midterms. And they're
Yeah.
not addressing at the core some of these things you're talking about, like a farm bill. I've
Yeah.
been surprised just the optics of it that we've gone through a couple of different versions of shutdowns, right? We had the bigger one a couple of months back, where we had part of the federal government shutting down. And as we talk right now, as we move toward the end of March, we have part of, like you go to the airport and you have these long lines because TSA is not getting funded and all that kind of stuff. Like
Yep.
the optics to me, I'm just curious what people think looking at that, but they keep taking breaks.
Yep.
And, we all get it that members of Congress need to go back home in their district and, talk to folks and all those kind of things. But when we're sort of in crisis mode, like we're in a war,
Yep.
regardless of what we want to call it, whether it's war or not war or whatever the heck it is, you would think the optics would be that, and we have no farm bill. Shouldn't they be there nonstop working at least 5 days a week, settle the shutdown, figure out what we're doing with the war, get the farm bill done? Like, that's the part I don't get. Like, what do you make of that? Like, maybe people don't care about that. I don't know.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, look, you can get in the short term, both parties can get their base whipped up and pull enough other voters along to
Hmm.
make an election in the short term. But I don't think that either party has really figured out a way to have a kind of a durable majority. And, look, I mean, politics is always fluid, politics is always changing. But, it wasn't too long ago that you would have one party kind of hold on to things for a while. Maybe they'd get a setback in the midterms, maybe they'd regain in the next, whatever, and then there'd be a bigger change. What they call a change election where the seat of government really flips completely. That's happened almost every cycle for the last several, you know.
Hmm.
And I think that, both parties have figured out that they got a way that they can kind of grab whatever the thing of the moment is to snatch it back. But being able to have a majority where you can govern and do something with a little bit more than just a couple moments time in political time has gotten really challenging for both. And I think in the case of this cycle, the GOP has to be very careful not to take rural voters for granted, and they got to make sure that they're speaking to the economic angst that rural voters face. And I think the Democrats have to, get serious about talking in these rural communities in a way that they haven't been. And, look, you talk about the war, perfect example of an issue that could totally distract from all that when the reality is the thing that makes people care the most about the war right now is what's going on with gas prices,
Hmm.
well, and in rural communities, what's going on with fertilizer prices, I mean, that kind
Diesel.
of thing. So, yeah, exactly. And so, does the war matter? Absolutely. But if our political leaders get themselves wrapped around the axle on whatever the latest political fight in Washington is over the war, as opposed to the real impacts of the war right now, which are in addition to, wanting to make sure, of course, that our troops are safe and that whatever the American objective is needs to be carried out, can be executed in a way that accomplishes it and people can be safe day to day, the war equals economic issues for people too.
Okay, so what I don't want to say what's practical. Let's forget the practical side of this. But give us something that would make sense to you that we can do, whether it's going through Congress, whether it's just federal policy with the Trump administration. Like, you get out and talk to various groups and travel to different parts of the country. So you're talking to a lot of different folks. You understand politics, you understand ag. Like, what is something that truly will help? And I realize that one of my bigger criticisms of the mainstream media is a lot of times we look for like one thing, sort of like what you talked about earlier, like what's to blame for this, what can help for this. But even if it's just like a sector, what is something that can help? You mentioned that we do have some growth, whether people are doing specialty crops, organic, whatever it is, but it's also hard to build a market. USDA got rid of some grants that helped some local farmers provide food for like schools, daycares, all those kind of things. So that made it a little more challenging. We do have farmers markets that can maybe help, but like policy wise or focus wise, like what's something that can help?
Yep. So, relatively speaking, a shorter term thing and a fairly clear practical thing is trying to find a way, and there's ways to do this on state and federal level in the tax code, ways to make it more economical for that aging generation of farmers to turn around and sell the farm to that next generation of farmers. Now, what I mean by that is, instead of having to give into the development pressures or anything else, having the ability to say, hey, we're going to make sure this farm goes in the hands of someone who wants to farm it. Sometimes that's sons or daughters, which buying the farm on land contract like you used to do back in the day is not as affordable anymore because the farms are having a harder time, continuing to turn a consistent profit. And that farm in that transition has to make enough money for the younger generation to be able to
Hmm.
make contract payments. And those land contract payments a lot of times have to be big enough to be able to fund a retirement for the farmer, right? It used to be easier, not never was easy, but it used to be easier back in the 60s and 70s to do that kind of thing. Harder now. So making it more economical for that aging farmer to do that, especially in situations where they don't have a son or daughter to take over. It is hard and it would be good to make it more economical in those situations where sons or daughters are buying. But think about situations where they aren't. For an aging farmer to take a chance on someone outside the family as opposed to, just saying, okay, I'll sell for
Hmm.
development, the case may be, that's challenging. So legislation that would bring down the costs for the aging farmer generation, make it more economical for them to sell the farm over time, and maybe pairing that with apprenticeship programs that can get, those young farmers, maybe they aren't part of a farm family, but they can prove that they're going to be responsible stewards of that farm. That kind of a policy solution is out there and it's relatively straightforward and shorter term. Longer term, we need more research and development and all kinds of steps to make sure our markets internationally and domestically are fair to farmers so that we can have new innovation coming in and farms of all sizes able to, you know, have new entrepreneur opportunity, which hasn't happened in this country for a very long time for our farmers. But that's a short term thing and then maybe a long term thing we could bridge toward.
I feel like my life is sort of a full circle in that I grew up in a town of about 45,000 in southern Illinois, and I now live in a Des Moines metro suburb of almost exactly 45,000. So clearly that's where I'm supposed to be. But when you're talking about some of these rural areas, and I see a lot of what's happening in Iowa. It has 99 counties. More than two-thirds of them have been shrinking in population for decades.
Yeah.
So while you're talking about supporting farmers, it's so hard to convince people to remain in those smaller communities when it gets harder and harder and harder. And while I was sort of joking with you about, you're sort of the typical guy here where you're doing multiple things professionally, like that's what a lot of folks have to do, right? Like if it's a married couple, one of the two of them frequently will have an off-farm job, whether it's for insurance or the additional income or whatever it is. In some cases, it's both of them, right? Like that to me just does not seem like a sustained, no offense to, and I'm not questioning anybody's commitment by any
Yeah.
means, the opposite really. But man, that's gonna wear you out. And I'm wondering, like the little kids, like you mentioned, your daughter, like as they see mom and dad like just busting their butt nonstop, almost 7 days a week. You do your whatever job during the day, and you're trying to farm in the evening or whatever. Like that can't be sustainable, is it?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Look, I mean, we got nearly 2 million farms left in this country, even though we've lost 70% of them. And of those nearly 2 million, 96% are family farms, 88% are small family farms. And people say, how are they holding on? They're doing it by doing 2 to 3 jobs. And in our case, my dad is still farming, my sister working to take over. You
Hmm.
know, yeah, that's kind of economic reality that our family and other farm families are fighting through. You know, for me, working to tell our story and with my writing and other consulting work, wearing more than one hat, I guess it's just a habit that I picked up, seeing
Yeah.
people doing things. But the reality is that I see it in the Midwest. I see it in California, everywhere. There are small towns where the farms have been disappearing, and that means you got farm families holding on, through kind of multiple different jack of all trades situations. And then you've got, rural communities that have been impacted. And it doesn't matter whether it's, the hills of southern Wisconsin where I grew up or small towns outside of the Sacramento Farm to Fork region where I spend time when I'm in California, my wife's family. These small towns, they are shrinking, and they're losing their economy in part, not only, but in part because the farms that built these towns have been slipping away. And then there's this shift from rural to urban of our overall economy. And you got it ripples through all these communities.
I don't know enough yet about this topic, but I'm gonna try to throw it out to you anyway. But since you mentioned the farm bill, I saw a story throwing out the idea of maybe that's an outdated focus and we need essentially 50 farm bills and just figure it out on the state level. I have no idea mechanically how that would work, but if we're in this idea with the current presidential administration about like education, for example, let's empower the states, sort of block grants, however the funding works, let them sort of figure this out. But like, which is one of the many reasons why I'm fascinated with your life. Obviously, what's happening in southern Wisconsin versus Sacramento area, agriculturally, super different, right? So many different crops, weather, everything. So, like, is the way we do the farm bill not really modern enough to meet the individual needs of folks?
There's a really good case for it, and without necessarily arguing for any specific proposal, I'll say this. A way for our farm programs to be more closely tailored to what's going on in the local communities, meaning, perhaps there is more state decision making in order to do that. There's value to that idea, and it's got to be paired, I think, with another thing, which is I've said we need a bipartisan family farm moonshot in this country, which is to say we got all these federal programs piled one on top of the other. And whether each one had merit or not, we could argue about every single one, both ways. We could have that discussion and have a good one. But the reality is that we don't know which ones are working anymore. We don't know which ones are contradictory, and we don't know which ones have fallen, prone to favoritism and abuse, which always happens with programs after over time if they haven't been monitored and reformed, right? And so if there's a way to really evaluate that and say which programs are having an impact and need to continue, which programs are not, or which ones are harmful, or what have you, if we can do that, and in the course of that, have more decision making going to states so that, Wisconsin is making decisions around what's going to be most helpful and fair to its dairy sector, its corn,
Mm-hmm.
soybean, other row crop sector. It's cranberry and other niche products, right? In California, with all of its fresh produce and specialty crops, and everywhere in between, there's a world where it makes sense because a lot of times these federal programs, no matter how well conceived they might be, by the time it trickles down to the local farmer in the state that's affected, um, whether or not the program or the dollar assistance or whatever is even meaningful anymore can be really hard to be a reality.
So when you're out talking to groups, especially those who are actively farming, what's on their mind most?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the biggest thing that's on their mind is the rising costs. Now it varies group to group, but you got
Sure.
people like, look, here we go again. We see higher fertilizer prices, and it
Hmm.
didn't have to be fertilizer prices this year. There's always something where
Yeah.
the reality is that we've got, and I also, it kind of goes beyond the usual griping anybody will do, right? Because like we've got one input cost or another generally skyrocketing, even though you've got the price that farmers get. Um, bumping up and down, but never
Hmm.
keeping pace, right? And so I think that is still just the biggest squeeze. It's just like, well, what are we going to do about these increasing costs? And that's the thing that I hear most. From there, I do hear a lot of people asking questions about the local food movement and is there a way to do something with this or
Hmm.
and then you'll see the hot buttons, tariffs or whatever the issue of the day is. People will ask about that because they're worried.
The one thing that I think about, and I don't understand this nearly well enough, is that I see these headlines about how food banks, food pantries are so strapped and have been, especially the last couple of years, as consumer prices for food have gone up so much post-COVID and whatever is behind all of these things. But we have people who are interested in growing local whatever, meat, produce, whatever. And we have so many people who are hungry and need, a lot of them are sort of the working poor, if you will, the working folks who just need a little bit extra. It seems like in some perfect scenario, we could find a way to connect that.
Absolutely. That's the thing. I mean, that is one of a number of places where like the demand for local food, regional food, specialty food markets, it exists. We just need to help build more of those connections and we need it to grow. And one of the things that'll really help is right now, we have government programs here and there that try to make those connections. And I'm not
Hmm.
saying things are necessarily bad or good. It depends upon the program. Sometimes if something's done really effectively, it can work. But what we really need is enough demand for stronger natural market infrastructure to grow. What I mean by that is, your average family farm in Wisconsin that's growing traditional crops has a grain elevator to go to sell corn, soybeans, traditional wheat, what have you, but it's harder to find and figure out where your market is going to be if you want to grow, you know, artisan tomatoes or specialty garlic,
Hmm.
some other or an organic crop. I mean, there is infrastructure there. There's some of it happening, but to have those family farms make that change, it's a really big change, and it doesn't always pencil out immediately, or over time. And sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. The real reason for this is that we don't have a lot of market infrastructure where you got distributors buying up specialty crop. Like you don't have a lot of farmers who can point and say, hey, you know what? I could go into that crop and I could make money there. I
Hmm.
mean, there are some of those opportunities, but they aren't necessarily strong enough to make sense for enough farms, and there aren't enough of those opportunities. So we need more of them. So that goes back to what can we do? I mean, the reality is that like if every single person in this country bought their food partially by trying to figure out what they could buy from a local farmer, it'll grow those markets. And those farmers will continue to move in that direction to whatever degree they see dollars they can count on. And we'll have more market infrastructure. You have people saying, hey, if I can, round up a bunch of farmers to put some acres in this, and I know I can turn around and sell it in the local economy. We need more of those opportunities to be real and durable for more farmers to be able to make those transitions. There are some folks taking risks to making it work, and some folks finding it doesn't work for them right now. So, the American consumer can have a big impact on this.
Let's close out with a political slash ag question. So as we move toward the summer, through the summer, and start looking at those November midterms, that collision of politics and agriculture, what are the forces you're going to be watching that might help determine whether these rural areas swing one way or the other politically?
Yeah, absolutely. This theme plays out so many times in our modern news cycle. It also played out in Land Rich Cash Poor time and again as I was doing research, which is just the question of, are our political parties going to be operating in a way where you can see they understand what's actually happening on an economic level in our rural communities. And so I'm watching for that all the time. And if the GOP is distracted with whatever the big picture controversy is, either of their own making or of provocation from the other side or a global event or whatever, the GOP's stuck talking about that rather than saying, here's what we're doing economically, in Sauk County, Wisconsin. Um, that's going to say a lot about what's going to happen in the midterms. If the Democrats are, running on, social issues that tie back to their party's base nationally, but don't really have, even if people, have an opinion on it, it's not really something that someone cares about when they're trying to get their kids out the door to the school bus, local rural community. I think that's going to say a lot. So the midterm election is probably going to be challenging for the GOP from a structural standpoint because they're the party in power. And that usually means in a midterm, it's going to be an uphill climb. Doesn't mean they have to lose, or, if they do lose some ground, that it's going to be by a lot or a little. We don't know. It's going to be an uphill climb. But I think the thing that I'll watch most closely is what kind of conversation are both parties having in our rural communities. I think that's going to say a lot because rural communities powered the GOP's victories and can therefore be the things that, the Democrats can ease them back on. And it powered them in these battleground states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and there's a lot of other key political states like Iowa where, like, what's going on in our rural communities matters a lot more than I think the national media necessarily grasps.
I totally agree. Brian, it's always good to catch up with you. Thanks for the perspective.
It's good to be with you. I really appreciate it.
Brian's book, Land Rich, Cash Poor, is now out in paperback. You can learn more about the book, about Brian's background. You can do both of those things by checking out our profile piece about him. You'll find it in the American Farmland Owner newsletter. It's free, comes out every week. It's full of interviews with thought leaders with their unique insights about the challenges and opportunities for farmland owners, operators, and investors. And you can find it now at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for joining us here on the podcast, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.